The Michael Berry Show.
Dr. Mary Talley Bowden, who has evangelized against the dangers of that damn clot shot, informed me, because I believe she has a podcast. She has continued. She's on the warpath. I don't think she'll ever stop. And I hope she doesn't ever stop. I hope nobody who was affected by this will ever stop, lest we forget what happened. She brought to my attention a fellow by the name of Derrick Wynn, who I understand was kicked out of the Army for refusing the clot shot that killed so many people, including my brother. And he has been spending the last 3.5 years since then trying to get politicians to act on provable crimes within the Department of Defense. And there's more that he is up to, and we will visit with him now. Derrick Wynn, first of all, thank you for being willing to serve our country before this awful thing was done to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So tell me what happened, and take your time. We're in no hurry. Tell me how long you served and where you served, and then we'll get to how you were kicked out from doing what you were meant to do.
All right. I enlisted pretty much at the height of COVID, when they were still kind of touting that the vaccine would be voluntary, and they still had this very compassionate, loving kind of tone. And so I never really thought that the mandate would really reach me, especially not, in the infantry. I was joining as an infantryman. So I joined. I went through boot camp in June of 2020. I served until July of 2022, and I enlisted. Yeah, pretty much at the height of COVID. I never thought that it would get to me, and slowly but surely, as they were able to kind of convince more and more people to get this thing, their tone slowly changed. And once they had basically, 51% of the population to comply with this, everything became about, mandates, and the coercive tactics and stuff like that really started to kind of show their face.
Derrick, you make an interesting point, and that is that once people made the decision to submit themselves, to subjugate themselves to the suggestion of something that was going to protect them, most of that was based on fear. It was not based on their better instincts. I never took the shot and never would. But once people made that decision, it was interesting to watch them transform from, now that I did it, all of you have to do it. And it's sort of like, when someone wears green on St. Patrick's Day, they're very keen that you do, or they pinch you extra hard because they need the validation of the bandwagon. The lemmings want other lemmings to jump off the cliff with them because there is comfort in company. And I noticed that people, once they did that, became more willing to support authoritarianism. So it went from, hey, let's all do this so we all live, because we all want to live, to you do it or we'll kill you. And it sounds like that's kind of the point at which we got to with you, and then walk me through from there.
Yes, so I've said from the beginning, every opportunity I've had, that this was a litmus test for freedom. And if we had collectively kind of shrugged this off, they would have never gotten this far. But they kept eroding away at us and moving the goalposts as the game went on. But once I started to,
I'm not sure if
once it was mandated within the DoD,
earlier, but a few days ago,
the Secretary of Defense mandated that every service member were to take an FDA-approved vaccine.
Italy.
And at the time, there was no such vaccine ever made. There was no such vaccine in the DoD's possession whatsoever. So it was physically impossible to comply with these mandates, even if you wanted to. And they knew this from the start. And what they were doing is knowingly falsely representing EUA products as if they were FDA-approved vaccines, which was basically not giving these soldiers informed consent as to what was being put into their bodies. So they weren't able to basically...
He's also expected to step down as chairman of the University
they weren't able
of Houston
to. They never had full knowledge of what these vaccines were, and the DoD was knowingly falsely misrepresenting what these products were because they were trying to sell this new mRNA technology, and we were basically being used as the guinea pigs for these first batches because all of our medical information was stored into one database, the DMED system. Okay, that allows all of them to circumnavigate all the HIPAA laws that prevent your doctor from talking to my doctor and comparing notes. And since we believe that they were running basically a global test on this new mRNA technology, we were being used as a subset for the entire country because all of our spouses and all of our children, they all received care through the DMED system as well. So it made us the perfect little petri dish. And so within the DoD, whistleblowers got a hold of the DMED system, and they basically were trying to expose these huge upticks in all these adverse side effects caused as a direct result of these shots. And instead of listening to these people, they silenced them and locked them out of their credentials so they could no longer access the database. And then they went in and fudged the numbers. They said the system went down. A bunch of people have screenshots of this, of the numbers before they were changed. And they're trying to do everything they can to obfuscate the data to make it to where there's no direct correlation between all these adverse side effects and the mRNA technology.
He's going to want to make a difference. He's going to want to be
there was a battle within the DoD going on right after the mandate, and people within the
Derrick, hold with me. Go to reception. Derrick Wynn was kicked out of the Army for refusing the Clot shot.
Took over
but he refuses to be kept down. This story gets more interesting.
Got a new basketball arena built.
All right, so problems at the DoD.
He started raising money in a medical center. University of Houston is the better performer. My undergraduate degree is worth more
they never
because
had
of his service
an FDA-approved vaccine within their possession, so people like myself were basically
no doubt in my mind.
Withstanding all the coercive tactics that they were using against us.
You need a good urban.
Let me back it up. It initially started off completely voluntary, and they had this very nice,
Rice is a different deal. It's a small
so many
private
people
school. You
complied,
need a good urban university. People can have a job by day. They can work
inevitable.
And I'm very grateful for that. Tillman's also a sponsor of our show, which we are grateful.
So you could see all this interagency collusion between the CDC, the World Health Organization, the DoD, and it was like as soon as the CDC would approve, they approved one vaccine, right? And the very day that it was approved, it was pulled from market and never produced. And then they piggybacked all of these EUA products onto this one vaccine that got approved. And they said, oh, well, these vaccines are made with the same formulation, so you could just use them as if they were the same ones. Okay, so then that gave them the authorization to start pushing these EUA vaccines onto us, where they were falsely representing this product as if it was FDA approved, because they were saying, oh, this is pretty much the same. But there's a legal and a medical distinction between these two vaccines. Okay, so there was like a tug of war going on within the legal office because people basically caught them. They had these big, huge, grand plans, and they forgot to dot one I and cross one T, and we caught them on it in a checkmate move, basically. So what they had to do is they had to send the Secretary of Manpower, I believe, her name is Terry Aderin. She came out and wrote a force-wide memo, and I don't have it on me because I'm not at my desk, but it says something along the lines of, you could use these EUA products as if they were FDA-approved vaccines. And that's what gave basically all the legal offices within the DoD the green light to start hammering down on anybody who refused this stuff. And they were using every tactic they could think of. They were weaponizing. What they did is they framed this as a force readiness issue, because we were technically at war with COVID. So they framed this as a force readiness issue, and they started targeting leaders from the top down, okay? And you can track this all the way up to the top. And so what they did is they targeted leaders, and they said, this is a force readiness issue. If you can't get 100% of your people vaccinated, they're not deployable. So you're not you're not a combat effective unit. So if you can't get the job done, we'll replace you with somebody who can. So now everyone in a leadership position is now put in this, they weaponized basically your life or your livelihood. And they put leaders in a position to where they had to choose, to burn the guys below them to protect their careers, or, basically destroy themselves. And very few people lack the integrity to choose the hard left instead of the easy right. And it trickled downwards. And so that created an environment to where you couldn't report the corruption of your commanding officer because the guy reading the paperwork was the guy who forced him to do it. So all of this basically bending the knee, it trickled downwards. And I was a PFC. I wasn't in very long, and I was at the bottom of the totem pole. So the layers of failure that had to happen to get to me are just astounding, and I was lucky enough to have a decent enough team who, once I was able to articulate a very clear reasoning for why I was refusing and I was able to lay out my case, I was able to directly articulate my case to them. They were like, wow, dude, you got it sewn up. You actually taught me some stuff. I might have to go back and rethink my decisions, but, I'll go to bat for you if I can. But as soon as the paperwork went up the chain of command to some people I'd never met, people that never knew me, I've got stacks of paperwork from everybody I've ever worked with saying I was a stellar soldier, but the people that had never met me, they were passing down this stuff from a legal office. Every step of the way, this was, everybody delegated their leadership to legal offices. So lawyers were kind of running plays on this the entire time, telling people what to do, handing them memos, basically cookie cutter memos to sign and stuff like that, because there was no playbook for this. So every air quotes leader just delegated their command authority to some lawyer who then basically told them to do what was in the best interest of the DoD as a whole, instead of the people who they were put in position to protect and lead. So they created an environment within the DoD that basically they turned the heat up. They were basically telling us, I was in a unit that went on a 9-month rotation. Some of my guys were there for 9 months to Europe. And typically when you're allowed to come home, you get like a week or two to go visit your family because you've been gone for so long. And they told these young, impressionable kids, days before we left, that, hey, if you're not vaccinated, you're not going to be able to go home and see your family. So, of course, these young guys line up, and they use, everything they could to squeeze, and whittle people down until, because everybody talked a big game at first. Everybody's like, oh, they're going to have to hold me down, and I'm not taking it. But, man, they put every ounce of pressure they could on our throats, and they used every tactic they could, and a lot of people folded, and people. Because of that, it created like this momentum within the DoD. It was just like an avalanche of authority, basically, and we became like the others. And it was an incentive to burn people. And at the time, there was such a culture. This was such a contentious subject to even suggest, that the vaccine didn't come from a wet market. We were being called conspiracy theorists for even saying that. And then we were being called conspiracy theorists and for refusing to believe that this, vaccine that they cooked up in months, that was, expedited, basically, we were supposed to believe that was the end all be all. And any hesitation to that, there were people within the DoD that were labeled as insider threats for refusing the vaccine. People who had stellar careers. Senior Airman Lance Castle, look his story up. He was a 17-year airman. I believe he might have had a little bit more time than that. He was months away from retiring when this happened. And he refused the vaccine, and his leadership did everything they could to burn him for it. They put him on trumped-up charges, and he beat those charges. And since he was on trial and not his leadership, they just sent him back to his unit. Oh, you're innocent. Go back to your unit. You're good to go. So that same leadership was now in charge of him again, and they just did it again. And he was trying to report what happened to him and try to get anybody to listen to him.
Derrick,
so he sent out
Derrick, hold on a moment.
Yes, sir.
You're making my blood boil. This is infuriating.
Yes, sir. It's the tip of the iceberg.
More with Derrick.
He just shows me what it's like to be, a real man. I have never met someone so wonderful. I call him
Mr. Michael Berry.
Brad Gloria, who booked our interviews, took a position with Sirius Radio, and because we just weren't doing as many interviews, and I didn't want to do that as much as we were because people were complaining. They wanted more of us talking and fewer interviews. And I find that a lot of interviews are just some guy pitching a book or some guy with some project coming on. And it just really, there's no value to the listener. And then you have a situation where somebody's not selling anything and they come to your attention. A doctor named Mary Talley Bowden, who's been on the warpath over this craziness in COVID, sent me a message, said, hey, you may want to talk to this guy. I talked to him. I think she has a podcast. She said, I talked to him, and this is your kind of story. And he was kicked out of the Army for refusing the COVID shot. And I'm listening to him talk, and I hear these stories, and it just makes me so damn mad. We're not talking about saying to somebody, hey, sorry, but I'm not going to serve you a hamburger today because you didn't take the COVID shot. We're talking about people who've dedicated their lives to being a nurse or a pilot or, in this case, a warrior in our Army, and you're gonna dishonor them in this way. I can tell, Derrick, I am a person that believes that if people, when they're wronged, would stand up and fight back and not allow it to happen, a lot fewer people in the future would be wronged. When a woman is raped, hunt that man down, prosecute him, have every person you know help you. When a child, if when the priests or pastors or Boy Scout leaders or anyone else is a pedophile with a kid, if the parents would, instead of saying, well, we don't want to do anything, just, and they didn't allow him just to be relocated, but went after him, it would save people in the future. The fact that I can hear the anger in your voice, and that's what I encourage. That's how you bring about change. I can tell you are a fighter, and seem like you'd be very good for the United States Army because you got me all fired the F up. That's for sure. All right, so go ahead.
Yes, sir. So the reason why this is so important to me is because I truly believe in the values. I was willing to die for what this military stands for and for what this country stands for. So these ethos that the DoD pretends to portray, like loyalty, duty, respect, honor, courage, selfless sacrifice, all that, like I was willing to die for those values. And until those values are truly portrayed by this institution and there's accountability for what happened to us, the DoD is a hollow husk of everything that it claims to be. And people of value in this country will no longer serve. And there was a mass exodus as a direct result of this vaccine mandate. And generational families that have served this country are telling their children to never serve in the United States military because of what happened to us. And until that's righted, the DoD will get quantity over quality, if that. They may get a couple Trump bumps and every now and again, but people of value no longer want to serve this institution. And this is a voluntary force. So we as a country will fail if there's not accountability for what happened to people who are willing to serve in this organization. Like you can give them all the incentives you want, all the bonuses you want or whatever. You can't buy people that are willing to die on a battlefield to protect the homeland. That's in the heart of this country, and they're spitting in the face of that by trying to cover up what happened and obfuscate the truth and blame everything on DEI. DEI is an incredible annoyance, and there is a huge tactical issue with all the issues of DEI, but it is being used as a scapegoat to cover up the mass exodus from the DoD of people who are truly willing to die for this country. And people, if they didn't leave, they're retiring as soon as they can, and they're checking out. And that's why I believe, they're focusing so much on retention numbers are so good. But within the DoD, people, whistleblowers were trying to call this out, all these issues that were happening, and they silenced them instead of listening to them. And I believe, and a lot of other people believe, it's because this new mRNA technology has trillions and trillions of dollars set to be made behind it. And if people within the DoD were coming out and telling the public, hey, there's a lot of issues with that, they wouldn't have been able to sell that to anybody. There wouldn't have been a single, they wouldn't have been able to incentivize you with, $100 gift cards or, a dozen Krispy Kremes or whatever they were using to try to trick people into this. Because the thing was, you had to take it voluntarily. because if you took it voluntarily, you don't have a claim later on in the future if it does mess you up. So the way that they rolled this out showed it's like a huge level of premeditation. And this premeditation, we can prove within the DOD, because everybody that committed crimes signed their name at the bottom of crimes. Everything that's done in the DOD is done through paperwork. And we can extrapolate the same tactics that were used on us within the DOD onto every sector of society, basically. Mary Talley Bowden, police officers, firefighters, teachers, every single one of them, they squeezed them in the same way. They were basically using the DOD as like a little testing grounds to see what they could get away with. And then you extrapolate that onto the civilian population. So we can prove all of that. But the thing is our fight has been so nichely within the DOD, and we've been inside this echo chamber for the last few years that, the general population has no idea what they truly did. And they're trying to basically get away with it. It's as if the DOD jaywalked on the way to commit a murder, and they're like apologizing for the jaywalking and then trying to say, it's everything's okay. They're offering to buy us back with back pay and stuff like that, which is nothing more than hush money to cover up their crimes. Because if enough people fall for it, they can then say the recruiting and retention crisis wasn't as bad, because, look at all these people who came back. But what they did is they basically forced us into financial ruin by just changing our lives, out of nowhere, destroying everything we had, and then dangling back pay that was already allotted to them by the taxpayers anyways, and dangling back pay in front of us as if that's an incentive to come back. Like we're some battered wives who are just going to forgive, what was done to us without a true, even apology, even an acknowledgement. And there's an order of operations to what needs to happen in here. And the DOD seems to be fully willing to skip over the acknowledgement part. It wants to obfuscate the truth and pretend as if this was like a political thing, but it was an institutional thing that was being done, and it was extrapolated throughout every sector of our society. And whistleblowers within the DOD, there's hundreds of us, can prove it. And I've spent the last 3.5 years trying to get my congressman, Brian Babin, trying to get Senator Ted Cruz, Governor Greg Abbott. I'm a signatory of a document called the Declaration of Military Accountability.
Yep. Hold just a moment.
Yes, sir.
You led perfectly into what I wanted to talk about. Well, let's talk about Brian Babin's office. I'm disappointed to hear that his staff will not let him speak with you, which he could make that happen if he wanted to, because Brian Babin's son Leif, I don't know if it's Leif or Leif, is good buddies with Jocko Willink, and he's a guy's a badass Navy SEAL, and you would assume this guy would be very pro military guy. I'm disappointed and surprised by
the
this.
Michael Berry Show.
What's happened there?
Yes, sir. Well, so there's the Constitution and there's the institution. Okay, and there's people who are willing to die for the Constitution, and there are people who are willing to die for the institution. Okay. And if he's so connected with the DOD, he may not have the integrity to tell people, tell his buddies, hey, you messed up, and that's not an easy conversation to have. And so I think, especially with all this money behind this technology, I think it's political suicide to really rock this boat. So I think politicians have done everything in their power to keep me at arm's distance and treat me as a disgruntled individual instead of a canary in the coal mine, so that they can keep their heads safely buried in the sand and pretend to still be out here like these charlatans, pretending to represent us. But in actuality, in my opinion, they're looking out for themselves. At least that's the opinion I get from his office, because like I said, I've never been able to actually have a conversation with him directly. I've gone to the office and begged them to schedule a phone meeting. I've begged them for a Skype meeting. I told them I'd drive to Washington on my own dime if that's what it took for me to get a face-to-face. And every time they give me these polite pleasantries just to get me off the phone. And for years, I believed them, and I thought, maybe it's just a scheduling thing or whatever. And they kind of gaslit me into trying to, shut me up. But after calling and as the narrative shifted more and more in our favor and more things came to light to expose that I wasn't just some paranoid schizophrenic showing up to their office with some 3-ring binder full of files, I thought for sure that they would, gain some type of appetite to listen to my plea. But the more they tried to basically just get me to shut up, the more I realized that they had zero desire to look into this, which, I'm bringing to them crimes against humanity, and they're out there pretending to be these, Captain America conservatives, when in reality, they don't care. I mean, their actions at least lead me to believe, or their lack thereof lead me to believe that they have, no desire to help the people in what was an obvious, bait and switch, an obvious coercive, top-down tyranny, basically. And so people like Ted Cruz, he gets out there. I had spent hours on the phone with his former military legislative assistant, Tim Dill. Okay. And I explained to him the intricacies of what happened, and there's no way whatsoever they were not knowledgeable of what basically the things I'm telling you right now, because I talked to them about it, and they the entire time were like, oh, we're going to have to talk to our lawyers about this and blah, blah, blah. And so he has the opportunity to get the heads of the DOD and the State Department and all that under oath in front of the world and in front of the American people. And he knowingly and willingly only focused on the fact that all of the religious accommodation requests within the DOD, they were being blanket denied. So up until COVID, if you didn't want to get a vaccine for whatever reasons, you could file a request to not get it. And they were handing them out willy-nilly because you weren't being used as a lab rat at the time. So when people started filing religious accommodation requests because they believed XYZ was in the shots, or for whatever reasons, honestly, a lot of people were just using it as a way to get out of it because they saw that as a way to get out of it. So the DOD was blanket denying all of these because they couldn't have anybody in the DOD not getting tested. It would mess up their statistics and their numbers. So they went through thousands and thousands, like hundreds of thousands of these requests, and we're denying them at a rate, like somebody did the math, but it was like every few seconds, just long enough for them to find where to click to deny. They were just powering through these things. And that's a constitutional violation. So Ted Cruz gets the head of the DOD on oath. He knows about the totality of the bait and switch that was done to us, but he instead uses that as an opportunity to grandstand to his constituents about how he's an advocate for religious freedom and he's going to fight for our religious rights and blah, 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 knowing that there's a greater crime that was committed, but he refused to say a single word about it. And that, to me, told me everything I needed to know. So we initially, there was a document drafted called the Declaration of Military Accountability, and 231 service members signed it, and I handed this document to Governor Ted Cruz. All right, my local representative is Briscoe Cain.
But hold on. Not Governor Ted Cruz. You mean Governor Greg Abbott? My
apologies. Yes, sir. Yes, my apologies.
Right. Okay, so go ahead.
So my elected representative, my local representative is Briscoe Cain. He got a hold of my number, and I spent hours talking to him on the phone about this. And he told me there was nothing he could do for me because Texas House was out of session. I had to wait 9 months before he could do anything. So he stayed conveniently silent on it. But through him, he was doing a campaigning event, and Greg Abbott was in town. So I showed up to that event, and I personally handed the Declaration of Military Accountability and some more paperwork to Governor Greg Abbott himself. I have photo evidence of me doing it, and I pled with him for a good 30, 45 seconds. Please look into this. There's, I was made homeless because of this, and there's all kinds of people falling through the cracks because of what was done on an institutional level, and I begged him to look into it, and I've never once gotten a single phone call back from anyone in his office. I've never once seen him make a post about it. I've never once and so even my congressman, Brian Babin, I go in there and talk to them, and I'd say, hey, the people need to know what happened. I'm seeing you all day, every day, posting these dumb posts like about Taco Tuesday and these irrelevant things that mean nothing. And you can't make one social media post about this. So they were basically gaslighting me and telling me, oh, we can't make individual posts for people with individual grievances. And they were trying to do everything they could to treat me as a disgruntled individual. Anytime they wanted to talk to me, it was about, oh, how can we get you back in the military? Or how can we get your discharge status upgraded? You know, they were basically trying to work with the government to cover up our crimes. They deleted all of the negative paperwork that they gave us for refusing the shot internally. And now, basically, in 20 years' time, the only proof that we were kicked out for refusing the shot is like these stacks of paperwork that each one of us have. That's the only thing proving I'm not some crazy nut job that just made it all up, because they doctored all the paperwork.
We are out of time, but our conversation continues. There will be plenty more of this interview on our podcast. It will be listed as bonus podcast with Derrick Wynn, U.S. Army. They'll be posted to the podcast, and you can hear it in its entirety, including the bonus portions over there.
The Michael Berry Show.